Next, Mark Crispin Miller is joined by Anne Bernays to discuss her father and the new edition of his 1928 book, Propaganda. The program is 45 minutes.
Thank you all for coming. I wrote the introduction to this reissue, this new edition of Edward Bernays' classic Propaganda. We're also lucky to have with us tonight a member of Edward Bernays' family. I'm going to introduce her at the end of my remarks. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the historical context for this book, and then I'll turn the event over to our other guest. When Edward Bernays published Propaganda, the word itself was pejorative in much the same way it is today. When we say someone does propaganda or is doing or writing propaganda, we don't usually mean that as a compliment. We've come to accept the word as a kind of synonym for lying. Well, the interesting thing about this word is that it did not have that kind of a pejorative connotation really before World War I. The word was actually coined by the Vatican in 1622. Propaganda was recognized by the Curia as a necessary function for the church to perform in defense against the spread of Protestantism. Protestantism was a big success. It was very popular. And Pope Gregory XV, therefore, urged the creation of an office for the propagation of the faith, which is known as the Propaganda, and which still exists, is still part of the Vatican. It was intended to supervise missionary activities abroad. So the first thing to understand about propaganda is that its original use was by no means pejorative. In fact, it was regarded as really the holiest of activities, and by definition, dissemination of the truth. St. Paul was deemed, and still may be considered, the first great propagandist in history, as he devoted himself to spreading the gospel all over the then known world. Well, the word became pejorative after a couple of centuries of neutral use. People would refer to propaganda without any particular negative thrust. It became pejorative because of its use in World War II by propagandists in the West. The word actually became commonplace. It became well known because of the activities of Allied propagandists in World War I, who would use the word throughout their propaganda about the Germans, use the word always and exclusively to refer to what the Germans did. So in British and American war propaganda, you would only encounter the word propaganda when our propagandists were referring to anything that the Germans said. And because it was an alien word with many syllables in it, it naturally had a sinister ring to it, and its exclusive use in conjunction with the enemy made it seem to be a fairly reliable synonym for deception. Deliberate lies or half-truths, all the things that we associate propaganda with today. Never did the American propagandists or the British propagandists refer to their own propaganda. And interestingly, there seems to be some evidence that a lot of the discussion of the word propaganda by our propagandists was sincere. I mean, that is to say, people sincerely believed that they weren't doing propaganda on our side. Only the enemy did propaganda. We were telling the truth. We were providing information. You know, the great American propaganda office was the Office of War Information. Well, that usage stuck in the West at any rate. Propaganda remained a negative word. Some people, some professionals were not entirely happy about this, and that was the case with Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays had been a very busy publicist before the war. He'd worked in the world of theater publicity, but he had a very exalted notion of what propaganda really ought to be, and in his view, propaganda should call itself by its true name. He thought that those who use it as a pejorative term are misusing it, that those who are practitioners of propaganda have no reason to be ashamed of it, that it performs a very useful and necessary social function. So one of the points of Bernays' book, published in 1928, I think, is to try to reclaim the word, to make the word respectable again. Because in his estimation, and he said as much in his autobiography, it was a shame that a perfectly good word like this could not be used in polite society, or could only be used as an insult. And in a way, he's right, because there really is no other word for propaganda. We could call it spin, we could call it hype. All kinds of euphemisms come to mind. We call it political communication, or strategic communication, or public relations, or advertising. Well, really, the most efficient word for the thing itself is propaganda. And Bernays wanted to make that point. Now, he was, I think, single-handedly responsible for exalting the reputation of public relations. He's known as the father of public relations, and this is an epithet that he himself used quite a bit and took pride in. The background to this is that the world of puffery, advertising, PR, whatever you want to call it, throughout the 19th century was rather disreputable. Advertising and all similar related kinds of puffery had a very bad reputation. In the business community, it was associated with patent medicines, poisonous non-cures that were represented as cure-alls. It was also associated with the advertisement of cigarettes. It didn't have a very happy reputation. It wasn't until World War I that propaganda became respectable because of its association with the fight for civilization. As all of those who worked in the disparate fields of propaganda, advertising, PR, etc., they all came together to collaborate on this patriotic project to save the world for democracy, to sell Liberty bonds and so on. All of this enabled that profession to become self-conscious and unafraid to sell itself as propaganda once the war was over. In fact, the 20s saw a tremendous explosion of books, high-minded seeming books, extolling the virtues and the uses of propaganda to the business community especially. This was, in fact, a wave of post-war propaganda on behalf of propaganda. Edward Bernays was the most famous and accomplished of all these professionals. He was the one most self-conscious in using the term public relations, since propaganda was a term that really could no longer be used. And the book is, it is really a fascinating thing to read. It was not a success as a work meant to rescue the word from pejorative use. Interestingly, the same year that propaganda came out, there was another book published both here and in Britain called Lies in Wartime, or The Use of Lies in Wartime, by a member of Parliament named Arthur Ponsonby. And this was a retrospective sort of expose of how the British propagandists in World War I had made everything up. It's basically a catalog of all the most notorious and hideous lies that have been told about the Germans, the case of the crucified Canadian. The Germans crucified some Canadian, cut off the breasts of nurses, impaled babies on bayonets, and so on. These were really notorious and highly influential tales. Ponsonby, in a very scholarly way, refuted them all and demonstrated that the whole gruesome narrative of the German rape of Belgium was really a tissue of lies and half-truths. That book was a big success. And that book basically anticipated the public attitude toward propaganda from then on. Although Bernays was extremely successful at what he did and brilliant at the kind of work he did, and much sought after by business interests, and also did some work in government, he never really succeeded in making propaganda respectable, certainly among the intelligentsia. And shortly after his book came out, with the onset of the Great Depression, propaganda's reputation just sank lower, because now people's distrust of official lying was exacerbated by the disappointments of the Depression and all the sort of stock market driven propaganda of the 20s seemed even more deceptive in retrospect, so that by the 30s, propaganda was definitely a dirty word. Interestingly, it was a dirty word that was not yet associated with communism particularly. As a matter of fact, in the 30s, as more and more people came to learn the truth about advertising and marketing, as more and more of the details of how the war propagandists of the Great War had really made stuff up and taken people in. As that happened, the word propaganda became, really for the first and only time in its history, familiar to everyone as a word denoting deceptions that originate on our own side. The propaganda, to many of us who have grown up since the Cold War, seems like a foreign thing, an alien thing. And to many people over a certain age, propaganda is always and forever to be associated with communism. Communist propaganda, it's redundant. It's like tax and spend Democrat, communist propaganda. All propaganda is communist. Well, before the Cold War, and before World War II, in the 30s in particular, there was a tremendous amount of healthy suspicion and distrust of propaganda, and a general sense that it tended to come from institutions here at home, tended to come from our government, tended to come from our banks, tended to come from our corporations. So there was a kind of populist moment when the word was more or less accurately used. Well, one could talk endlessly about the uses and abuses of propaganda in the present. I actually really find myself wondering what Edward Bernays would make of the current administration, which is reliant on propaganda of a particular kind to an extent that I would never have imagined outside works of fiction. I don't know what he would have thought of that, but in his own time and in his own place, he believed that propaganda served a necessary function, that democracy couldn't function without it, that the masses were basically not all that capable of sorting things out for themselves. They needed to have things explained to them. He was heavily influenced by Walter Lippmann, who had a kind of tragic view of the impossibility of real democracy. Bernays' view was not that tragic. He was sort of unapologetic in his view of how propaganda really should work at the hands of the clever and clued-in few for the sake of the bewildered many. And I think his honesty is actually laudable. Most celebrants of propaganda aren't that honest. So having given you that very general introduction now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Anne Bernays, Edward Bernays' daughter, She's a novelist and a teacher. She teaches at the Nyman Center at Harvard University, and she has a forthcoming novel called Trophy House. Please join me in welcoming Anne Bernays.
Before I start, I'd just like a show of hands, please. How many people have ever heard of this man? No. My father. 4, 5? Okay. Are you his students? Okay. Well, I'm trying to get a hold on some way to communicate to you how powerful he was and how pervasive his influence was. And maybe I'll tell a little anecdote to show you what I mean. There was a man named Adam Curtis who called me from London a couple of years ago, and he said, "I'm Adam Curtis and I work for the BBC, and I want to do a hour-long broadcast television thing on your father." And I was completely charmed I think by his accent more than anything. And I said, sure. And he came and saw me, and he interviewed me at length, maybe 4 or 5 hours. He interviewed my sister, who didn't like him. And then he came back and interviewed me again a second year. And then he called me. He said, finally, the tapes are ready. I'm going to send you a tape. And he sent me the tape. And it made my father out to be a villain on a par with Hitler. And it was absolutely amazing. And I thought, this is the first time I've ever been on the other side, because I always thought my father was a manipulator. And although he did believe in it honestly, he was an elitist. And that's something that I have never been. So I was asked by my publisher, by your publisher, by his publisher, not my publisher, to talk about what it was like to live with this man. And I lived with him for almost 25 years, and then I lived in the same city with him, and he lived to be 103. So when I was growing up, I knew what public relations was. I knew what it was called, but I didn't know what it was. And so when people asked me what my father did, all my friends' fathers were, because we went to a very fancy private school, doctors and lawyers and people who worked for the government and bridge builders and all that. And I said, my father's in public relations. And they said, what's that? And I couldn't tell them. I think I'll start with telling you some of the good things about living with my father, some of the sunny hours, and then go on to the other side of it. First of all, he could make friends with almost anybody. He could sit down with any of you, and within 5 minutes, you would be telling him your life story, including your sex life. He used to come and ask my friends how their sex life was. Oh, Eddie, stop. Everybody called him Eddie except the people who worked for him. They were not allowed to call him Eddie. They had to call him Mr. Bernays. He had one man who worked for him in his office for something like 35 years. And this man was known as Mr. Cutler, and my father was known by Mr. Cutler as Mr. Bernays. That never changed. But everybody else called him Eddie, including us. That is, his children. We were not allowed to call him Dad or Pop or Daddy or anything like that. We had to call him Eddie. One time, my husband, who was sitting in the front row, and my father and I were driving out to some part of Long Island, and I don't remember why we were there, but the car broke down, and the person who was driving the car stopped at a little gas station, and my husband and I took a little walk, and we came back, and my father was sitting on a folding chair like these chairs, talking to an old, fat Italian woman, and they were talking together as if they had been lifelong friends. I'd never seen anything like it. She was smiling and laughing and using her hands, and they were just having the most wonderful talk, and it was an off-guard moment of my father's, he had very few such off-guard moments. Mostly it was spent being on. He was, so he was very, very sociable. He loved women. He chased them around the house when he got older. That wasn't such fun. One time he brought home a mummy in a glass case. It was about this big, and it had an X-ray with it. And my mother said, "What's that?" And he said, "That's an Egyptian princess," and showed her the X-ray with a scarab on her chest like this. And he just loved that mummy. He bought it at auction. He just went in. I mean, how many people would do that? He went in. He was completely spontaneous. And if you expected anything from him, forget it. He never once gave my mother a birthday present. But he would bring her presents at other times. So it was unexpected. He was great with small children. He absolutely adored small children and knew exactly how to behave with them. So he was really a paradox to me, because he had all these sort of spurts of generosity and spontaneity and kindness. And on the other hand, he was a tyrant. I remember, for instance, many dinner table where I left in tears, and because I questioned something my father said, and his face would get purple, and he'd bang his hand on the table and said, "You're wrong," and make me cry and leave the table. There was only one way of doing things, and that was his way, and that's a very hard way to grow up. So there was never any dialogue with him. It was his way or no way. Do any of you know the play Life with Father? You could raise your hand. It was a play about a Victorian household by a man named Clarence Darrow, and they made a play out of it, and then they made a movie out of it. What? I'm sorry, Clarence Day. Wrong class. And the father was an absolute tyrant. In the play and in the movie, this tyrant was lovable, but tyrants are not lovable. Tyrants oppress you, and they make you feel terrible, and they make you feel stupid. And for the first maybe 35 years of my life, I felt stupid, and I finally realized I wasn't. He had an absolute view of publicity, which was, the example of this, I sang in a chorus for years and years and years, and we gave concerts, and nobody ever reviewed them. And one time I said to him, "Oh, I just feel awful. Nobody ever reviews our concerts. They're so good." People came to the concerts, but nobody reviewed them. You know what he said to me? "If nobody reviewed it, it didn't happen." So that was his view of life, and this carried over into everything he did. He was a complete workaholic before the word was invented. He was so focused on his work that all his social contacts, everything he did was connected to his work. He never had a hobby. He never played a game. Never saw him play a game of cards. Never saw him do anything that wasn't connected with his work. Oh, one other good thing my husband reminded me. When he didn't care anything about the way he looked. So when he got older, he owned one suit and one pair of shoes. Literally, I'm not kidding. And I remember when he was quite old, and he was halfway into Alzheimer's. I bought him a pair of sneakers, black sneakers, and he wouldn't even try them on. He got terribly angry. And he looked like a bagman at the end of his life. He really did. But he just didn't care. I mean, he didn't buy cufflinks and all the, the stuff. My mother dressed him when he was younger, but he never cared at all. He was, this workaholic thing was so pronounced that on Sundays, when he couldn't work and he couldn't phone people, he stayed silent all day. He wouldn't communicate with anybody. He couldn't talk. He was completely unavailable to me and my sister in ways that fathers usually are. For instance, in the 10 years that I went to this same school, I don't remember his ever visiting once. I don't want to sound like I feel sorry for myself because I've come to terms with this, but I thought everybody was like this. I didn't know any better. But he was a really strange man. He was an elitist. And by the way, there is a word that you left out there is a good synonym for propaganda, which he used a lot, persuasion. Yeah?
You can talk about that.
Okay. He really was an elitist, and he had a great sense of class. At the top were the people who were smart and had the power. And then came the people who worked for those people. And then below that, probably the great masses of people. And he, as you said, he didn't really have much faith in the masses of people. But he was really an awful snob, and he never learned to drive. It reminds me of a joke whose punchline is, thank God he didn't have to. But one summer years ago, when my kids were very small, they rented a house in a exurb of Boston, and of course they they rented a Cadillac, or they bought a Cadillac, I don't remember which it was, and they hired a driver who was a graduate student at Harvard who really didn't know how to drive at all. And he scolded me and my husband for sitting with the driver and talking to him. So this is what I had to put up with. On the other hand, he put his cousin, Sophie Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's grandchild, through Radcliffe. And I'm sure did a lot of other very generous things without making any noise about it or telling anybody about it. He was really a paradox and a mixture of things. You never could tell what he was going to do, but one thing he did not set out to do was to he didn't know how to be with me and my sister. He didn't know how to talk to us without telling us what to do. So it was rough. It really was. It was rough for a long, long time. And then at the very end, if you read a book called The Father of Spin, you will see that by Larry Tye, you'll see that at the end he really got into a lot of trouble, and the worst qualities came out and sort of in spades. So that's about what I've got to say. That's about 15 minutes. And do we have question and answer? Mm-hmm.
Yes? Now we're supposed to wait until the mic comes to you.
And then we have to repeat the question.
Then we have to repeat the question. There's a lot of work here. Okay.
Thank you very much for speaking about your father. I was interested in hearing, you said that for 35 years you felt stupid. Mm-hmm. And I wondered what was the deciding event that you realized you weren't?
Well, I guess when I started... but when did I decide I wasn't stupid? I'm not, still not sure. I still have moments where I think I must be really horribly stupid. I started publishing novels, and I know novelists aren't intellectuals, but they have to have something going, something. So I think that's what it was.
Hi, I would like to know how you think his personal qualities translated into his work.
How did his personal
How did his personal qualities translate into his work? One is that he was intensely focused. Another is that he made imaginative leaps, always. He could yoke ideas anytime, any place. I mean, you'd see, I can't even reproduce it for you. I mean, if I sat down and thought about it for a while, I could give you a really good example. But he could take idea A and idea M and somehow make them, marry them and make it work. And so that that was the unpredictability. You read about poets and you read about novelists and they're drinkers, and thank God he didn't drink, and thank God he wasn't an abuser. But what his addictions were his work, were the thoughts that went on in his head and the problems he was solving all the time. He never stopped working. And so that I didn't know any of this. I mean, this is all hindsight. This is, if he had said to me when I was a child, if I sometimes seem to neglect you, I don't mean to, but I'm really very busy with this problem or something like that. He was really sort of very close to being a genius, I think.
What were his favorite books and writers?
His favorite books and writers. What were his favorite books and writers? I remember when he read a novel. Somebody sent him a novel. It was a novel by a young man named Myron S. Kaufman, and it was called Remember Me to God. Has anybody ever heard of this novel? It was an okay novel. It wasn't bad. But somehow he read this novel, and he thought it was the greatest thing he ever read. And he went around telling everybody about Remember Me to God. And it was the only novel he ever read. On the other hand, now I'm remembering something. He did, with two other people, when he was a Broadway publicist, wrote a book of poetry and published it. And I can't remember the name of it. I've got it at home. I can't remember the name of it, but that's a really odd thing. His favorite books were books by sociologists like Gordon Allport and, unreadable things. But since he never stopped, he almost never went to the movies. I think maybe in his whole life he saw 5 movies. I don't know whether he ever went to plays, because that would distract him from what was going on up here. And he was a totally focused person on his work.
I'm curious as to what your father's personal views about war were. I mean, obviously nobody likes war, but in terms of being for the mechanism or against it, or what his views were in that.
Well, I grew up. Do you want to answer? What were my father's views about war? Well, he certainly, as a Jew in the Second World War, he was very much for that war, as everybody was, and particularly Jews. And he did an awful lot to, with book publishers. He worked with book publishers and got low-cost books to our boys in the Army overseas. He never discussed that with me, and I don't remember it ever coming up. I would think he would be skeptical as a solution.
Can I I ask a question?
Yeah.
I take it that he never talked about his work at home.
He always talked about his work.
Did he talk about the things he was working
Oh,
on?
all the time. That was what happened at dinner. That was the only thing he talked about. That was all there was. I mean, it was a monomania, his work. As I said, I never saw him play a game. I never saw him hold a hand of cards or throw a pair of dice or bounce a ball or play tennis or nothing. He just was totally into his work, and he lived it. Yeah.
Do you? I wonder if you remember any of the projects that he was working on. Was there one dinner that you remember that maybe you connected to what his product was, or that something connected to the real world for you?
How did whether any of his projects or ever cropped up in our social life? Is that it? In our dinner talk?
That's kind of what I wanted to know, too.
No, it didn't. I just felt I really felt left out. I really felt as if I was listening to this powerful personality, and being mostly passive, as my sister was, and my mother, who was a really brilliant woman, was often very quiet also. She was extremely verbal and brilliant.
So
But-
he just held forth.
Mostly. Is that, Justin, is that your, did he hold forth? Eddie?
Occasionally, when he was focused on, when Annie's father was focused on a certain project, we would hear about it. For example, when we were first married and I would come to Annie's house for dinner, I would hear a great deal about the United Fruit Company and the amazing discovery that someone had made that bananas were a surefire cure for celiac disease in children. And this was, in the way that public relations works, this was a very effective piece of information because the United Fruit Company was now given the role of the savior of Americans' children, whereas they were ripping Guatemala off like crazy.
What year was that?
49? No, it couldn't have been 49 because you didn't know me then. 53 maybe?
It was during the coup, you mean?
Yeah,
How are you going to repeat that whole comment to the audience?
I can't. I can't.
Let me try, because
Okay.
it's worth their hearing.
Yeah, okay.
Her husband, Justin Kaplan, remembers Edward Bernays talking, evidently at the time of the coup in Guatemala, which would be 1954, about some discovery about bananas. His client was the United Fruit Company, which basically was Guatemala. And he discussed at the table the discovery, or the allegation, it was the discovery that bananas were a cure for celiac disease.
Well,
Did
not
you
a cure. Because,
alleviate the symptoms.
Right.
So
One
he
of the
talked
few
about this
things
as a kind of public relations boon, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the United Fruit, it was just a wisecrack. Let me just say one thing about that. What's so interesting to me in this is that this is a guy who always prided himself, as you made clear here, on his mastery of the situation, on his mastery of his craft, and his mastery of mass consciousness. He had this notion of himself as a kind of propaganda master that we also recognize in people like Goebbels. I mean, I don't mean to take that comparison any further, but this notion that they're wizards who can kind of control how the masses feel about things. Sounds like that's the way he treated his family, too. What's interesting to me is that, you know, when someone says, if it wasn't reviewed, it didn't happen, that means that they're kind of they're traipsing onto the terrain of the irrational, where everything is not controllable and you're not in complete command. And one of the things that strikes me as most interesting about his autobiography is the chapter on Guatemala, where he's working for the United Fruit Company. He's intimately involved with the coup and all its developments. And the chapter is very strange because obviously the version that he was constantly selling was the government version of the CIA's coup. Now, he never sort of puts it that way or admits it, but throughout the chapter he keeps saying, I tried and tried to get some reliable information about what was going on, and I just couldn't get that information. He says that repeatedly. And I think that's because the information, the truth, was something he didn't want to hear and couldn't hear.
That's it.
Right?
That's it.
But he was, concerned about bananas and celiac disease. 2 more questions.
Okay, there's one back there.
What was his relationship with Sigmund Freud?
You mean, what was his relationship with Sigmund Freud? He was responsible, he was a nephew, double nephew, and he was responsible for getting Sigmund Freud first published in America, excuse me, by Bone Eye and Liverite. I didn't need some water. Thanks. And he sent Freud cigars.
Mark mentioned this in his remarks. What do you think he would think about what's going on today, specifically like the Bush administration? What do you think he would feel about it?
He wants to know what you would think.
I didn't know. He wants to know what he would have thought about the Bush
Well, he
administration.
voted as a Democrat all his life, if I believe him. Except he did work for Dewey once, but I think he would be appalled. I really do. I mean, as I am.
Okay, one more. Oh, same question.
Can you do that?
Can I elaborate on
Yes.
this? He would have been appalled?
Yes.
Well, he told me. Is that all right? Within its proper confines, propaganda, as he discussed it and as he used it, is defensible. I mean, there are a lot of ways, it seems to me, in which the book is disingenuous, and I talk about that in the introduction. But when it comes to specific tasks set by a client, is my favorite example. This is an example of how smart he was. He had a client who made pianos. I forget the name of the company. Incidentally, every example in the book Propaganda, which is, he always refers to them sort of in the passive tense, and then there was this campaign. This is an example. They're all his campaigns. So the book is really, it's an ad for his services, which is fine, because he was amazingly good at what he did. And here's an example. How do you sell piano? How do you sell more pianos? And he had nothing but contempt for the vulgar tout, who would slap posters all over the place, say, buy this piano, it's really a good piano. That was complete vulgarity, that was puffery. He had the idea of concocting a trend toward building music rooms in houses.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the same thing with buying books. He got architects to put bookshelves in the houses they were building. So this is what I mean by putting these two ideas together. I mean, none of us here would have thought of that. We would have gone to the publisher and say, you got to sell more books, and here's how you might sell more books. But if you put a series of bookshelves in a house,
What are you going to put in there?
what, tchotchkes?
Pianos, So, within that context, propaganda in its place, you know, it's kind of hard to argue with it unless you have moral qualms about the thing being sold. Like, you know, he did work for the American Tobacco Company, for example, and I guess he was.
Yes, but he would
remorseful
never
about
take
that.
a liquor client.
Right.
Never. Wouldn't do it.
The thing is that now the propagandist's frame of mind has been put at the service of an administration that is completely out of touch with reality and wants to force reality into the mold of its propaganda design. I mean, if you get intelligence that doesn't suit your purpose, which is to go to war with Iraq, you just get different intelligence. And you ask the guy who's doing the intelligence, Richard Clark, will you just find evidence that Iraq was behind 9/11, please? If there's scientific information, I know this would horrify him because he was a real rationalist. There's scientific information that's been discovered by your FDA, you know, one of your agencies, and it kind of contradicts your religious scruples. For example, there's been proven to be no connection between contraception and breast cancer. Well, you don't want that study to be posted. You don't want the results posted on your government website because that, you know, our propaganda says that there is a relationship between them because people who use contraception deserve breast cancer, right? I could go on listing instances like this where we're talking more about Orwell than we are about Bernays. And the fact is, it is ultimately, and I think that this haunted him, your father, it's ultimately an irrational business. Because if you say it didn't happen if it wasn't reviewed, well, that's fine if you're just sticking to the realm of reviewing shows. But when you're talking about life and death matters, when you're actually able to you're able to believe your own propaganda and you take umbrage at people who argue with it, then you're in the territory of the irrational, and then the comparison to the Nazis is apt.
Do you have a final, Anne or Margaret, final?
I'm a little curious and having a difficulty on this leap of faith that he would be appalled. I mean, the current administration is absolute masters of his field, and even though he may have had some qualms about some of his clients or his subjects when he took on United Fruit in the 1950s,
He would
it's not such a
probably
big leap.
say they are doing something very wrong very well.
Let me add to that Bernays was a progressive. A lot of the people who were involved in the propaganda business early in the century, like George Creel, the guy who ran the Office of War Information, I mean, these were progressives. These were people who, you know, believed in the liberal agenda. They were kind of dictatorial about it. But they would never have gone for a kind of theocratic crackpottery like we have now. I mean, this is a pre-Enlightenment presidency,
Right.
and an anti-Enlightenment. I'm not kidding. Sounds like a joke, but it's the sad truth. This is an anti-Enlightenment administration.
Right.
They don't believe in reason, and that would have.
It's the dark ages again. I really think so. Anyway, thank you all for coming.
The new edition of Edward